I used to work in Sydney with an organisation called Action for World Development. And when we closed AWD in Sydney, we sent our entire archive to the State Archives. Somewhere in the bowels of the State Archives are about 20 boxes of the materials of AWD, because AWD was the first interchurch social justice organisation starting in about 1973. World Council of Churches, Catholic bishops, Greek Orthodoxes, you name it, got together and formed themselves into a group. And at that time it was all about Aboriginal land rights, ban the bomb, all that sort of stuff that we were doing, Vietnam War. So I'm coming out of that background. I'm a primary school teacher in education. I'll give you my legal name. My name is Sister Diana Santleben. I'm a Dominican sister of Eastern Australia and the Solomon Islands. That's what we're called. And I've been a Dominican sister for 52 years. So, you know, for those of us who were born in the 1950s, who were baby boomers, we were born and raised in relative plenty. And I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, and at our all-girls Catholic high school, we had very progressive teachers who encouraged us to think outside the box and accept our social responsibility. My father was the local president of the Liberal Party in Strathfield. That's where I grew up. So you could say I come from a fairly comfortable middle-class background. And that's significant when you think of what we are doing to a certain extent now. But you do stand on the shoulders of everybody else when you're doing anything. So I taught in many primary schools. I taught at the Australian Catholic University, social justice subjects and primary education after I'd been a teacher for a while, you know. And then in about 1999, I got extremely sick and I couldn't work hard physical work. And that was wonderful because I became an invalid pensioner. There is nothing more wonderful if you're about 50 that you go on the pension when your brain is still working, but the government says you don't have to earn a living, if you know what I mean. So for 2 years I stayed in bed, and that's a big story. But after I got better, they wouldn't let me go back to doing what I had been doing. And every fortnight they sent money. And so I could basically do what I had a passion for. And at that time, refugees were starting to arrive in fairly significant numbers in Sydney. Now, I was just down at my local parish. I lived at Lidcombe, and the first refugee family I met was this family of 13 people. They had been brought from Egypt. They were South Sudanese, mum, dad, 11 children. And they were taken by the Australian government to settle in Launceston in Tasmania in July. So they had come straight from Egypt, where they'd been refugees, to Launceston in the middle of July. Now, the people of Launceston had been welcoming and lovely, but they were cold, horribly cold. All the kids got sick in the first week. And so for about 4 weeks, they had saved up their money because 11 kids, there was a fair bit of government, Centrelink money coming. And then they caught a plane to Sydney. And when they got to Sydney, they heard about that refugees were sort of coming to the Lidcombe-Auburn area. I don't know how, but they rocked up to the Catholic Church at Lidcombe and said, "Here we are. what'll we do? And so the priest rang me up. This is the absolute truth. I'm not kidding. The priest rang me up and said, there's 13 black people on our doorstep, and they want to know how can they settle in Australia. And I said, get them some sandwiches and some tea and I'll be down. Get them some food. Anyway, so I got down there, but before I went down there, I was really good friends of our local real estate agent, who was also in our church. So I went via the real estate agency and I walked in and I said to the lady, have you got a place for rent for 13 people? And she had a 4-bedroom old Department of Housing brick house just near Rookwood Cemetery. And so as I walked into the place, I had a strategy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a clue of what to do. So I walked in with that sense of confidence that we knew what we were doing. And there was a local organisation in Auburn called STARTS, which is Service of the STA, treatment of people, of survivors of torture and trauma, people who had bad times. But they also had good community connections. And I didn't know them, but they were the obvious people to go and get a bit of help. So eventually we were able to find them furniture and settle them down, and they are now citizens or brain surgeons or something. This happened a long time ago. But that's how I got involved. It would have been about 2000, the year 2000 was when Australia started to bring, with no preparation at all, really, that we ever saw, large numbers of people from Africa. And the families had been long-term refugees, some of them 20 years in refugee camp. They had never seen the inside of a modern house, or knew what a washing machine was for, or the 3 bins in the backyard, if you know what I'm saying. Yeah. Things were really complicated for them and complicated for us, because we were talking like if we were the Martians and they were the people from Jupiter, that was as much as we shared. We didn't have a lot in common, apart from the fact that they actually happened to be Catholic. And that's probably why they went around to the Catholic Church and knocked on the door, because they knew that the worldwide web of Catholicness certainly would have been something that they could grab hold of and go, well, maybe they'll help us. Okay, so that's how I actually got involved with refugees. Yeah. When we were involved with the refugees in Sydney, the numbers were staggering and the need was overwhelming. Because it was Lidcombe and Auburn, there were people who were leaving Villawood Detention Centre or coming from Baxter in South Australia, looking from young men from Afghanistan who had been boat people. And in those days, when you were a boat, up until about 2012, what used to happen with boat people is their need was overwhelming. You're in Afghanistan somewhere and everyone's going to be killed. So the young man in the family is told it's your responsibility to survive. So you are going to be given this much money and you've got to get out of Afghanistan and get yourself to some place where you can start again the family, or you can support the family. It is a sacred responsibility, exactly the same responsibility that my great-great-grandparents gave to my great-grandfather. But it was a famine in Ireland, exactly the same psychological thing. The teenagers left Ireland to survive. 2 went to America, 1 came to Australia. One of the ones who went to America was in the Civil War. He was lucky he got shot. When he got shot, he was given money. He went back to Ireland. He found my great-grandmother. They got married, had 8 children, and then came to find their brother in Australia. That's how my family came to Australia. It was responsibility to survive. Now, these young people, exactly the same thing. Of course, nobody in immigration sees that as a human responsibility. They see that as, you know, politics and all that stuff. But someday some good leader is going to explain this to the Australian people and they'll go, yeah, well, that's how our family came. So lots and lots and lots of need. They had no money, they had no furniture, they had nowhere to live, they had no clothes, they had no job. They needed to survive. So that there was lots of work for lots of us to do. And after a couple of years, remember, about 2000 till about 2004, I worked like a galley slave with a whole lot of other folks. And I was living with a 90-year-old, and we were paying rent in a house in Sydney, and we needed to get out of Sydney. I was going to burn out. I had other interests, like looking after the old sisters. And so I said to the refugees, Sydney is not Australia. If you want to flourish in Australia, you've got to get out of Sydney. And so they wouldn't. They just all stayed in Sydney, and I said, well, I'm going. So if you want to find me, come to Newcastle. And so I moved in 2005 with Sister Anne to Newcastle, and for a year I made my house the eco house, and we put solar panels, water tanks, you know, all the bling for eco stuff. I built a permaculture garden, and it's my little, shall we say, oasis that I live in. It's my survival point in Maryland, okay? So that's where I get my energy, my two doggies and my chooks and Sister Betty, and I live there now, okay? Sister Anne died after 5 years here, and she was 95, which was enough. She wasn't greedy. And so she took herself off. I was living on my own, and Sister Betty was living on her own. So getting back now, I arrived in 2005, and after a year I thought to myself, I'm having such a good time, but I've sort of done all the eco setting up. Will I go and work for the Hunter Wetlands and become a eco warrior? And Jenny Castles was sort of doing that a bit. She was Newcastle Citizen of the Year a couple of years ago. Or will I do something about refugees? I had my trailer. So I rang up the Catholic Church. This is how things happen. I rang up the Catholic Church and I said I didn't know any of these people, who is refugee person go to in Newcastle? And they went, oh, that'll be Sister Betty Brown. So I said, all right, have you got a phone number for her? And they said, this is her phone number. So by then it was 2006, so I rang her up, and I knew I'm a Dominican, she's a Josephite. If you need to know anything about the difference between a Dominican and Josephite, there's plenty of books to read. So I said, my name's Diana, I'm a Dominican, I have a trailer, could you use me? And she went, yeah. And so I became her friend. Now, what I learned about Sister Betty Brown really puts down the foundation of what we do and why we do it. Sister Betty Brown is now 89. She'll be 90 in October. So that makes her 17 years older than me. And so in 2006, she was, 70-something? And she was doing this refugee work. And she had asked somebody in the Redemptorists. There was this big monastery at Mayfield that had been closed and it was derelict, huge building. And when I first met her, the place was full of furniture that people of Newcastle had given her, and she was with friends, and the friends were, I didn't know who all these friends were, but anyway, I came and was a friend, okay? And so we met refugee families who were in Newcastle, and we gave them furniture and clothes, and it was like a refugee St. Vincent de Paul, shall I say.
Yeah.
Now, as I got to know Betty, what you've got to know, I didn't know a lot about her. I didn't know she was the famous Sister Betty Brown. I didn't know she had been the principal at Gateshead. I didn't know she had been, a sister of St. Joseph and anything. So after about a year of me carrying furniture, she said, would you like to come to my retirement? And I went, yeah, sure. What time is it? Oh, it's at the Catholic. Yeah, I'd never been to the Catholic thing because, you know, the Catholic thing is not exactly my scene. And so I rocked up in my sort of oldish clothes because I'd been carrying furniture that morning. And I walked in to the Victor Peter Suite, which is the hall next to, I think they use it for bingo or something, you know, this huge hall, and it's next to the Catholic Diocese offices. And it was full to busting with suits. And there was bishops and there were directors and there were principals and there were religious from various parishes and you name it. There were all these people here. And so I walked in sort of sand shoes and jeans sort of thing, you know, and they went, hello, and I said hello. And I realised that there was a complete and utter other life that Sister Betty had been living, and she'd invited me to the retirement of that life. She was head of library services for the Catholic schools of the Hunter Valley, basically. You know, like wow. she was really somebody. Yeah, she had been given this John Hurst Award for being. She had set up all the libraries in all the schools. She was a really famous lady. Okay, she was just a little old lady who was kind. And she knew all the names of the refugees. And after what I'd experienced in Sydney, somebody who knew the names of the kids. I never, ever got to know the names of the kids. There was too many of them. She knew everybody and she knew what their families were. My Gladys came as a refugee family of about 12 members. They had come from Liberia and they were called... There was Grandma, and then Grandma had brought all these children, and the children had brought all these little kids. And what you've got to know about Liberia is most girls have had their first child. Most girls have had their first child by the time they're 16. They didn't come with husbands or anything like that. It was just a large slab. Now, what had actually happened in Liberia is there'd been this vicious war where people were slaughtered in the streets, and her husband had been some sort of like police leader, and he'd had his head chopped off, and the girls' fathers had been killed and stuff. So Grandma had gathered all these people and said, I'm their mother. And they all went, yeah, you're our mother, Grandma. And you're all named... Some of them obviously were her children, but they weren't all her children. Some of them were, I reckon, orphans that she picked up along the way before they made it to the refugee camp and survived. This was how refugees survived. They survived against amazing odds. So you know, Gladys came, and she actually has a twin sister, and she has now her husband here, and about 6 or 7 of her children are here, and they're all young adults doing very well. She's a lovely lady, and she has a Bachelor of Nursing from this university, and so on. So, you know, we are still in contact, but it's because of Betty's love of people and her talent with communicating with them and being their friend. It's a real talent. You know, to a certain extent, I see it as a cause, or I see it as a project, and I'm good at that. But Betty is just a kind, loving woman. Wow. And I understood what Betty wasn't doing, what wasn't efficient. She had absolutely no professional distance. And every refugee in Newcastle knew where Sister Betty lived, and Sister Betty was available 24/7. And so if she was out in the backyard hanging her clothes on the line, they could have been sitting talking to her about their issues. And I knew we needed some place to call, not just a place for furniture and stuff, but a place to call a centre. And so you've got to know we had absolutely no money. No money at all. It was just us and about 20 friends. So we as you do, asked around town and tried to find a petrol station maybe that had been abandoned, or because nobody wanted to build on petrol stations, the soil's contaminated. We thought we could maybe use the petrol station building, and then we found out about police stations that had been closed after the police centre had been opened in Waratah and town, and all these little police stations had been basically abandoned. And somebody said to us, the Hamilton police station is lying derelict. Now, Hamilton police station is just down Beaumont Street near the clock tower. It's a very old building. It probably would be one of the oldest buildings in Newcastle. I don't know when it was first built, but it was the original Hamilton police station. And the police cells in that building look exactly the same as the police cells look at Richmond in Tasmania. And Richmond in Tasmania was built in about the 1820s. So it's a very old building. So we wrote to the Minister for Police, as you do, and said, "Dear Minister for Police, do you reckon you could give us the Hamilton police station for a refugee centre?" And we got a letter back saying, "Well, we'd be happy to give it to you, but it's only until the Aboriginal land claim that's on it is solved." But the land claim has been going for about 20 years because the law of Australia is that you can make a claim on it, like an Aboriginal group can make a claim on any government property that is abandoned, basically. And so they had a right to make a claim on it, but it had gone for years and years and years. And when Awabakal actually came, they had no idea they had a claim on it. It was so old, nobody knew, except maybe somebody in Sydney. It had been going on for so long. So the minister said, "Yeah, we've got this land claim on this place, but I guess you can have a go at it until the claim's settled." And the minister said to Sister Betty, "How much are you prepared to pay rent for a year?" And she went, $1. And so he said, "Yeah, that sounds fine." And so when we came out of the meeting, on the street, I'm not kidding, it was $2. On the street. How often do you see a $2 coin lying in the middle of the street? God gave us the first 2 years of the rent for that place. So that's how we went to Penola House. And we called it Penola House because Sister Betty is a Josephite, and Mary McKillop and Julian Tellison Woods started their work together at Penola in South Australia. And so we called it Penola House because it was a start, a place for refugees to have a different relationship to the relationship that governments do. Like across the road from Penola House was Northern Settlement Services. It's in Chaucer Street, the back of Penola House is there, and the Northern Settlement Services is there, and they're really our good chums now and always were our good chums. But they're government funded, and they follow government guidelines, and they do what the government tells them, and they don't make trouble, because you don't make trouble if you're a government employee. So they had a different relationship with things, because at the time, at the time, Northern Settlement Services had actually lost the contract to settle refugees in the Hunter. And the contract had been given to doing at the time what we thought and later documented, and was typical sort of things done by people who were a for-profit organisation. Started in Auburn. I knew where they had come from. They were an office upstairs across the road from Auburn Station, and they had a sign out the front, little office, saying English lessons given, and they were given $8 million to be contractors to settle refugees in this country. Now, I am asking you, if you want to settle somebody in your home, you don't go and hire somebody to settle them and not give them any supervision, no supervision of any sort. They had somebody who, I'll come to that story in a minute. We started Penola House with nobody telling us what to do. The Sisters of St. Joseph gave us $5,000, which would pay for our phones or whatever costs, whatever. It was the day we started Penola House, this poster, okay? And we called ourselves, the root thing is, our roots are in the community. That's how we set up ourselves. And because the Sisters of St. Joseph had supported us with a $5,000 grant, we called ourselves, not legally or anything, just the Josephite Refugee Support Network. And we had a facilitator come, and we said we need working groups that we were going to do things together. First of all, we needed a play group so that the little children could hear English spoken. We needed these children to have their cultural songs and stories told them, but we also needed them to have Australian cultural access. The women's groups, we knew we needed to do craft and family support, lots of issues. You know, you get halfway through your lunch and somebody walks in and they sit down and they go, they've just found my daughter in a refugee camp in Kenya, and I haven't got enough money to pay for the DNA test to prove she's my daughter. If I can pay for the DNA test to prove she's my daughter, then I can bring her to Australia and she can, you know. And Betty and I go, and how much money would that cost? Issue after issue after issues. Oh, coming in and going, my mother's just fallen in a fire in back at home, and she's on a bicycle and they're taking her to the hospital, but the hospital said she couldn't come in the door of the hospital until we paid $1,000. And so the fact was, we had no money, but we found it. We have, I suppose, over the past, since about 2007 when we started at Penola House, we have probably paid out for, you know, if you audited at us, every cent has been in those archives has been accounted for. But it would have to be millions. It would have to be. But every cent came from the generosity of the only money that we ever got from the Sisters of St. Joseph was money that was given to Betty because of her Josephiness. But it was only sort of, you know, getting their money. We were overwhelmed by the generosity of the people of Newcastle, and I'll come to that too. So we had community garden, we had projects, and, you know, we needed clerical people, we needed office managers. So that's how we set ourselves up. So that is the foundational document of Penola House. And we're very proud of it because actually we knew a thing or two about it, as you would appreciate. Betty had been a principal of the school and she'd been there and done that a few times. So we started out in 2007, and we had the very good fortune of having the Pashabalka disaster happen about exactly the same time as we went there. So the fact that the ceilings fell in and the carpets were being washed out the door, you've got to know what Hamilton was like. It meant that the police service went, oh, you poor darlings, and they came and put in new ceilings and new carpet for us because it was their building. And we would have never have been able to do that. So we had a fantastic time at Penola House. We did, you know, all of those things with men's programs, like we had a fishing group, we had the women doing sewing, we had singing and dancing and gardening and everything. However, the time came when the realities of the lives of some of the families was getting more complicated. And I want to talk about, I'll come back to, I know it's sitting there, I want to talk about the legal system of the refugees here in this country. Because a lot of our young people that we knew as little kids are now in the criminal justice system because of the fact that really as a nation we're really racist and our systems are inherently unjust. And so I guess if you're a kid growing up and you're not going to become a famous rugby league player or a famous basketballer or stuff. There isn't much employment going there for these young people. They came to Australia when they were 10, so they didn't speak English when they were 10, and then they learned enough English to be able to talk like colloquial English, but I don't know too many of our young people who got the HSC. And I certainly don't know a lot of and I'm talking about the African, especially the Sudanese kids. A lot of them missed out on going to uni, on getting professional qualifications. I'll give an example. There's a company here called the Hunter Valley Training Company, and there's a lovely woman who was part of the Hunter Youth Mentoring Collaborative, to which we also belonged. And we all sat around the table one day and said, we've got to do something about this youth unemployment, youth underemployment, youth undereducation. So there was a learning how to be a plumber trade school, so you could do your high school and your plumbing at the same time, sort of thing, And we thought that'd be really up the alley for the kids. So they said, well, to get in, you've got to have mechanical aptitude of some sort. We sent 12 of our boys. We got 100% failure rate. Not one single one of our boys knew what a hammer was or a screwdriver, knew, anything about how to hold a saw, or, they had no fathers. They had no life experience of getting under a car, mate, pass me the spanner, let's change the tyre and stuff. When cars break down, they're abandoned. When you move house, you leave all your furniture behind, sort of thing. It's complex, hard work that you do when you get involved with poor people. And they're not just poor people. If you're any sort of poor people, if you go down to poor people, it's socially poor people. I'm not talking about financially poor people at all. But say, for example, you go down to places like Windale, there's a lot of social disadvantage, not financial disadvantage as much, but because everybody gets some sort of government assistance. But their skills and their resources at moving house, at keeping your yard clean, and why bother keeping your yard clean, because it's not your yard anyway, and you're not even allowed to hang a picture on the wall because you're renting a place. And you know that you'll never own a house because the system is geared to investment housing rather than human beings with a roof over their head. We don't care about rib. As long as the capital gains tax and the negative gearing is making some people happy, then our people are going to be always at a disadvantage. And when you are in that situation, you get to be alienated. It's got nothing necessarily to do with the fact you're a refugee, but they are in that cohort of people in our society, and that cohort in our society is going to be struggling with the systems as they are now. However, let me get back. It's got this huge contract, and the things they did to people were so outstandingly stupid that it made the headlines of the Newcastle Herald often. And we've got books of Newcastle Herald articles about the things they did. They took a guy from the plane. He had no legs, and they had rented him a place on the second floor of a flat. They brought a family from to Newcastle, and the woman had no English. The child had sickle cell anemia, and they arrived in Newcastle on the Friday night. The caseworker said, "Here's a mobile phone. If there's trouble, ring 000, and we'll see you on Monday." Well, I don't know when it was. We'll say it was Saturday sometime. The child with sickle cell anemia went into some sort of cardiac problem, and the mother, of course, didn't know what to do with a mobile phone, so she ran out into the street screaming, and thank God somebody heard her screaming, could see that it was a woman in great distress, went into the house and found this child dying, and by the time the ambulance was called, the child died. Now, that is professional negligence of the worst kind, because if they didn't know the child had sickle cell anemia, they should have, and they should have put systems in place that made this family safe. So there were multiple things. So I just come along going, Bet, can I help you with my trailer? And so I used to have to go and visit families where they needed a bed, they said. A bed? Didn't Navitas give you a bed? So I'd arrive at this house, and in the front yard were piles of broken furniture, because you've got to know, like, see this chair? This chair's been around for a while, and it's strong enough to take my weight. But I can tell you, you can go and buy much cheaper furniture elsewhere. And then there's even, like, you can import even cheaper furniture if you've got a contract and you know how to do it. So they might have imported a shipping container full of tables and chairs for outer Malaysia or someplace. And so they ticked off the government's list, chairs, table, a blanket, a bed, a fridge, a washing machine. So tick, 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 tick. Okay? And there was a government contract to provide. So they had provided. There's the paperwork, prove it, they did. However, the truth of the matter was that night the bed fell to pieces. The freezer part of the fridge didn't close. The washing machine died. So Hunter Valley White Goods down here at Mayfield often had me take, like with my trailer, take down washing machines, and they said, there's no, it's a sealed unit. You can't mend this washing machine. It's so bad that the only thing you can do with this washing machine is take it to the tip. So within weeks, most of these families were reduced to zip in furniture and white goods because it was junk. The sheets were so bad that you wash them and, like, the stiffening stuff was washed out and it turned into muslin. And so the people of Newcastle would go, we've my granny's died, would you like everything in her house? We did fantastically good. And I can tell you, the fact is that, as a little old lady, I'm pretty good at this sort of stuff, and I don't do it much anymore because, quite frankly, I do get a bit of a sore hip after emptying a house. But the problem with was absolutely sheeted home to the government because we were in the media, and so got a bit cross, okay, because nobody was paying me to keep quiet, and so nobody was ordering me to keep quiet. So one day, for example, the bishop's secretary rang me, Bishop Bill's secretary rang me and said, do you know somebody there must be a national, and he said, do you know this person named, we'll call him Jim Shoes? And I went, no, I never heard of him. And he said, well, he knows who you are because he has just sent me a letter telling me, the bishop, to make me, Diana, keep quiet. And I said, how? Who is he? He said, he's a national. And he's telling me I have to keep you quiet. And I went, mate, he doesn't even know how to make me keep quiet. There's only one person on this planet who would make me keep quiet, and that was the boss of the Dominican Sisters. If you want to know, it certainly wouldn't be the bishop, And so the bishop went, I just wrote back to him and said, she's doing it for us. We're proud of her, Yeah. So we had this meeting at Penola House in about 2009, and I think it was probably in the archive. So, and the national, but the head of the government settlement of refugees in Australia, the state and the local, and they were all suits except the local. And you know what a suit is, don't you? It's a gentleman who doesn't seem to, have even the slightest thing out of place.
Yeah.
So suit one went, I'm Jim Shoes, I'm the national settlement person for refugees in Australia. I'm Bill Smith, I'm the state settlement, and my name is, and you can add this because in 50 years nobody will care, my name is, and I'm the local coordinator. And I said to Fred, and how long have you been the local government employee? She wasn't being paid by Navitas. She was employed by the government to oversee settlement of refugees in the Hunter Valley. I said, how long have you been the coordinator of that? And she went, 5 years. I said, well, then you should be in jail. And the suits all went, oh. And I said, because I have never met you. I have never met you. And the suits all go, well, come on. I said, was she there when house after house we went and threw out the furniture? Was she there when you wouldn't drag a dead dog backwards through the houses that Navitas was renting for these people? Was she there going, something's got to improve? Every time we've complained to the government, they just go, oh, it's teething problems. Well, teething problems should happen with babies. They shouldn't happen with a government contractor. And so you are responsible, and your leadership team are responsible for everything that happens to refugees in Newcastle. And we, for some weird reason, were the only people who were making a lot of trouble. Everyone should have been making trouble in Brisbane because it would be just as bad everywhere else. And the Newcastle Herald and NBN and all of us were friends. All of these elements of Newcastle make it so fantastic a place to be able to take on causes that nobody else has the freedom to take on, yet they believe in. I have many friends who have never spoken out publicly in the media, but go, thank you, you're speaking for us. So, of course, got the new contract, and the government kept on paying the money, and they still do. But they also now have more oversight. And so the system is a little bit better. But the problem now is actually so bad for all people, housing and employment in the Hunter Valley, that really nobody has a solution until there is a government-wide, social-wide addressing of affordable housing in this country. It is a terrible situation for everybody who has to rent a place. It's collapsed. I've been down to real estate agents and they've said to me, yes, that family needs to be moved. We have to move them, but we have absolutely no housing. If you're an incorporated association, you've got to know, there I was at home with Bet crying in the next room, and I'm thinking, how can we address this? So go to ASIC, get yourself a business name. We called ourselves Refugees and Partners. Get an ABN. We got an ABN. Doesn't cost any money. $150. Find 5 people, have an AGM, get a model constitution downloaded from the internet, and you exist. And that's how we started off Refugees and Partners. In my office, in my bedroom, setting it up with a group of friends. And our first AGM was held at the Jasmine Neighbourhood Centre, and there were about 30 people who came, most of them refugees, but lots of our friends. So we needed a place. And so a friend of mine gave me $10,000. So we rented a place in an old warehouse in Morgie Parade in Jasmine. And then we saw the Anglican church was derelict in Jasmine. Do you know Jasmine? There's the main Newcastle Road, a Jasmine Park with the lovely roses, and there's an old timber Anglican church on the hill, and it was derelict. So we contacted, and I'm finishing off Penola House because that was the end of Penola House when I took the sign off. But was by no means the end of our work. And so we wanted to use the Anglican church buildings, derelict buildings, closed buildings, filthy, neglected for many years buildings. So we wrote to Bishop Peter Stewart, the Anglican Bishop of Newcastle, and said, "Dear Bishop Peter Stewart, could we rent this place?" And we got a letter back saying, "No, sorry, you can't." And so we wrote again and we said, "We really want to rent this place because we want a refugee centre. And Jesmond is where all the refugees live. And it's a church. We could use the children's centre for the preschoolers. And then there's this lovely old army drill hall, which we could use for the women for learning English and doing whatever programs we want to do, like we did at Penola House, Bishop." And he wrote back and went, "No, can't have it." So we said, "All right, it sounds like you want to sell it. Sell it to us. We'll buy it off you for $1 or your price." So I gave him the choice to sell it to us for $1. So he should have given it to us for $1, but his price was $680,000. And we had $1,000 in the bank, and we wrote back and said sold. And on the day we had to pay the deposit, we had $68,000, and on the day we settled, we had $680,000. And the people of Newcastle believe in refugee hospitality. We raised that money from the pennies of the poor through to the corporate friends that came good with big bucks. We paid for it. And so we opened the place officially, like as ours owned place, in about March of 2019. We opened the new place as ours, like we bought it. And we had this big opening ceremony, and we sent invitations to the churches and the mayor and Sharon Claydon and Sonia Hornery and the refugees, and hundreds of people came. And the Member of Parliament were there, and the mayor was there, and 0 church people responded to the invitation. Come. I hadn't said anything publicly about them, but we had raised that money to buy that place. And so I want Jesus to be loved. I want the kingdom to come. And this was an opportunity for them to see that, but the new day is dawning. You know, there's hope, there's always forgiveness, and there's new life. You want me to tell you?
He was always getting in
but Jerome comes from Congo, and he is now about, I would say he's pushing 50, and he's the youngest of 12, married to Immaculée, who is the eldest of 10. And as far as I know, when Jerome came to Australia in about 2000, I'm not sure, I'll make it up, about 2010, give or take, he came on his own, and Immaculée was still in the refugee camp in Kenya. And he spoke perfect English. He had been working for NGOs for years. He was, as far as we know, the only survivor of his entire family on his side of the family. Everybody else had been killed in the slaughter, either in Congo or when they fled across the border into Burundi and Rwanda. He had seen all of that horror. And by good fortune, he didn't die. And so he married Immaculée, and he lived mostly in Nairobi because he was working for NGOs, and he would have come from a fairly middle-class Congolese family, farming family. Cows were his religion. And I don't mean that trivially. He once showed me a picture of a whole lot of cows, and he said, "See where the cows are standing there? About there was where they found my father." And he had been killed brutally. So he came with that background. His wife and kids were at home in Africa, in the refugee camp. And they had get up and go even from there. But she sent a message to Jerome and said, Jerome, here in the camp, we're all struggling, but I've got an idea. If you could send me $1,000, that would be enough for me to rent a building and set up a butcher shop. I'd need a chopping block and cutting knives and a saw, and I'd need a fridge and uniforms and a sign. And so we sent $1,000 to them. And so we've got in the archive these photos of the Penola butcher shop, or Bet Diana butcher shop, or whatever they called it. But it was I think it was the Penola butcher shop in the camp. And people would line up. If they had a goat, they chopped it into tiny sort of sections, and they all were allowed to buy a little plastic bag of protein. So they were not victims.
No.
They were not victims, they were survivors. And so when Immaculée came, she came with 5 kids at that stage. She came with 4 kids. Bonfields, the 2 bigger girls, and a little Bubba. And then we were told, after about a year or two, that there were 3 orphans that were found that could be brought. And one was Immaculée's sister, Fabiola, and 2 were nephews, I think, but all their families had been killed. But these 3 orphans were there. So they came and joined Jerome, so he then had 7 children. And they lived in Bray Street at Mayfield. And in the meantime, I had said to Jerome, and Jerome thought it through too, go to the University of Newcastle and get an Australian qualification. So he came here and did a Bachelor of Social Science. And I've always said to him, mate, you probably should be in Canberra in the Department of Foreign Affairs or something because of your life experience. Learn Arabic, because Arabic would be a language that maybe you need to know to be able to get a job down there. But, he speaks all these African languages, but because there's no much political, interest in Africa, really, he has never worked for them, really. So the Bachelor of Social Science really wasn't, in theory it was a good idea, but actually it didn't lead to a paid job. So then he and Immaculée had, how many kids did they have? They had another 3 or 4 kids. So they've ended up with 12 children. And bit by bit, he has come up with idea after idea after idea that, at one stage he said, look, if we go to a country town where there's a country community that will welcome our people, we can all become farmers and we can live in those cheap housing and live happily ever after. And it made sense. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. That's the truth. So we went up to Murrundi to have a look at Murrundi. And there's plenty of cheap housing up there, but there really there's no paid work up there. There's no TAFE up there. There's no real high schools up there. And there's certainly no hospital up there. And because of all those things, that didn't work. The same went another community we went to up near the Queensland border, and we tried that, and that community was so welcoming and stuff, but it only lasted a couple of years. It's just complex when you're trying to settle a farming family, when A, you don't own the land, and B, you've got to make money. It's nice to be... So a couple of the refugee families actually who were farming went to Mildura, and they seem to be making a bit of a go of it, because there's the MIA there, and there's lots of casual work that they can find out there, and fruit picking and all that sort of stuff. So that sort of worked a bit, but it's not by any means simple. And so at this moment, as far as I know, Jerome is still coming up with ideas. He's got a little organisation, Alliance for Peace. And And Alliance for Peace they came to see me a couple of months ago and said, what is Alliance for Peace doing wrong? And I said, nothing. I said, the problem with Alliance for Peace is complex, because what you're trying to do is international aid, and without a foundation in Australia that you can do it from. There's only so much. A lady rang me yesterday and she said, I want to solve this housing problem. And she said, there's all these people who are homeless and I want to get funding and I want to solve this because the homelessness is going to get worse. And I feel like saying to it, ring me back. I didn't say it rudely, but I really meant this. Ring me back when you've got land that you've got control of and about $5 or $6 million. There is a 2,000 square metre block of land in Martin Street, Shortland. You could put 25 units, the townhouses on it. And for 10 years, we have been talking to members of Parliament and people saying, why don't we do an affordable housing project there? We need about $5 or $6 million to do it. So this gentleman and lady walked into Penola House and said, what do you do here? And we went, well, we're sort of like a refugee centre. We do whatever is needed day to day. We teach English. We help people try and get job ready. We are partners with many other groups here in Newcastle. We know a fair thing about how the town works. And they said, good, we've come to the right place. We are a Dutch organisation called Hartig Vollebredt. And Hartig Vollebredt builds glasshouse complexes around the world. Here's some photographs of Hartig Vollebredt's glasshouses in Holland and in Scandinavia and in Japan and in, I don't know, wherever. So they showed us a whole lot of photos. And they said, what we are here for is because we know that refugees make really good employees in glasshouse complexes. And so I'm going, oh yeah. And he said, yes, and we're going to be building them out at Williamtown, and when we're building, we'll need 200 employees, full-time, permanent employees. Not casual, because we're going to be growing tomatoes, capsicums and cucumbers, and we do it every day of the year, and we keep supply to all the markets, because Newcastle is right in the centre where all the trade routes are, semi-trailer loads or trains or whatever, full of produce. I know nothing about farming. I was raised in Sydney, for God's sake. Anyway, I said, okay, I have the only one question I'm going to ask you. I can understand. No, I actually had two questions. My first question is, how are they going to get from Jesmond, where they live, to Williamtown when they've got bomb cars and they'll break down and they'll be late for work? And they said, we're going to have minibuses that go to the various hubs of Newcastle, picking them up and taking them, and then we'll bring them home of an afternoon. 12 minibuses as against 200 motor cars. We don't need to have a 200-car parking space. We only need, a 20-car parking space sort of thing. And I said, well, that answers my question. That's fantastic. My second question, after how the cars are going to be taken care of, I said, Steggles is the only employer in the Hunter that employs large numbers of our people. Everybody who works for Steggles is a casual, and there is a lot of trouble for getting permanent employment for our people. So I said, how do I sell this to people? And they said, no, they're going to be ordinary employees, just permanent full-time employees. I said, this is wonderful. I will kiss your feet. So after I'd spoken to them, they built out on at Williamtown the biggest glasshouse building you ever saw in all your life, and it's still out there. And they, because they had told us this, we told the TAFE, and the TAFE put on courses for every refugee and lots of other people in the Hunter to be ready to go and work for them. We had at least 200 people trained up, ready to go and work for them. and it was going to solve the problem of low-skilled, full-time permanent. People would be buying houses in Madawi and Cessnock and Kurri today if it had worked. It is a catastrophe. Raymond Terrace, think of all the places that, people could be affording in those, and then working there, just working away there, going out along Cabbage Tree Road to work every day by bus. But unfortunately, after about 2 or 3 years, and I'm sorry I can't remember the year, the red zone started to happen, the PFAS contamination of the land out there. The land was declared contaminated, and that really, to a certain extent, didn't matter because the land was not going to be actually used, but it made the banks who were putting up the money risk averse. And then we had a major flood out there, and the whole of the site went underwater for a couple of weeks, and the shipping containers that were there with all the materials in it were destroyed, and so the finishing of it was put back by some months. It wasn't finished, and the banks had agreed that there would be a crop by, we'll make it up, October, and that way there would be the first repayment of the debt, and the first crop wasn't going to happen until the following year in April or May. And so they went into voluntary administration, and they've never finished it, and it's sold, and it's a heartbreaking truth. I have a feeling the fact that we are a Labor town might have had something to do with it, because the state government and the federal government went over to Liberal, and as far as I know, and I have no proof of this, so it's just straight off me thinking, it seems rather strange that massive greenhouses have been built up at Inverell and Guyra, where there are national electorates, and where the transport issues would be stupid compared to Newcastle's transport issues. So it would make logic that why was there people supporting them being built up there? I have a feeling it's a political movement. We've lost families. We've lost families to Sydney. We've lost families to Melbourne and Brisbane and stuff. Them going off looking for some place where they can find employment. There's just not enough employment in the Hunter Valley. It's a heartbreaking truth. We need entrepreneurship. Now, one of the entrepreneurial things, and is my dream. At Tomago, they're going to build in the next couple of years a solar battery factory. Massive solar battery factory. And hopefully things like training organisations like TAFE will take our people and train them for construction of some things. Now, I know robots are going to do some things, but hopefully it will make more. I don't care whether the coal mob stops, because our people are not benefiting from the coal industry at all. So it's not my problem. The only benefit we get from the coal industry is they give us lots of nice funding. They're our friends, personal friends, and we do get good funding from those organisations. And I'm not naive enough to think that they're trying to become good corporate citizens for obvious reasons, and we benefit from it. But for employment, it's no help to our people. We really lobbied government to send more refugees to the Hunter Valley when we thought Maria's Farm Veggies was going to get up. Mm-hmm. And they doubled the number, and we got a huge number of the Afghan former interpreters. And in recent times we've had a lot of Syrians, and they're, very employable people. But sadly, there's no work for them here. Most of them are doing things like Uber or taxi driving or stuff, just bits of stuff, and they'll never be able to buy housing or anything like that. They've got to go off somewhere and find somewhere where they can do paid employment was that John approached us and he said that he had this passion that most of the students who were coming to the University of Newcastle were coming from a middle-class background, really. If they were international students, they come from a different background, but the Australians, generally speaking, come from intact families, generally, where they've been to the one high school and they know a fair bit about sport and they know a fair bit about getting good marks in the HSC, but they don't know much else. And he said he would like the students to have access to another aspect of life. And so that was John making that approach. The other approach that we've had, and I'll come to both, is from the medical school. We've had a lot to do with the medical school people because there's this, and the nursing school. There's a subject that they do in fifth year medicine, which is basically community service. And they're supposed to go and find a placement for a few weeks. And we often have medical students who've gone and been under the leadership of the Hunter New England Health Multicultural Service, that they're the ones who take them on, and then they bring students for a day with us so that they find out who we are and what happens with refugees in this town. The other thing is that there's a few fifth-year medical students who come to do a complete placement with us, and that's been really quite interesting. We've had a couple of them, obviously, and people who come from another country and sleep in a different way in that other country and come from the Northern Hemisphere, and there's all sorts of variables that would affect their sleep, and so the medical school found that really quite a fun thing to do. The education school hasn't actually, the academics have. They've come and done a couple of days of volunteer work with us. And, I've got photos of Professor Fischetti doing cement rendering of our cubby house, and the garden in the backyard is sort of like, I don't call it that, but it's sort of like the University of Newcastle Memorial Garden, because, a couple of the lecturers came and brought a whole lot of plants to plant there. So we've had a really fun time together. They've painted and whatever. Leadership of the university is struggling to get the students to be socially aware, because we had a program that John put on called Teach Outreach, where students could come and do a day a week or a day a fortnight, like volunteer work with us, and we've had a couple, but we really haven't had it. It hasn't really worked for the main group of students for all sorts of other variables. But I know what we're doing in years to come will be important, because it's like, how many times do I go to public meetings and stuff and people talk about how it was in Germany in the 1930s? Yeah. Yeah. Now, I wasn't born. My parents were in infant school, sort of thing, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So without having good archives, without having good movies, without having good ways of communicating how it was that a nation could go down that path, that, and that people who stood up with good leadership and went, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Yeah. Because we do have social challenges, but those social challenges, you don't need to scapegoat a group to solve those social challenges. You focus on the social challenges with good leadership. And so people like Paul Keating stood up at Redfern, and he said, if you can't imagine how it is for them, then you can't solve the problem. And so this is why I really am proud of the fact that the whole of the AWD archives is in existence. Okay. Every newsletter we ever put out, the letters to and from parliamentary people, all of that stuff exists. And while AWD was larger than Zara's house is, it's still able to be used as an example of social reality that, there were people who said, no, I don't agree with this is not right. Yeah, I'm proud.
You being able to just articulate it as well as you have is so valuable, because in years to come, people will be looking at this archive just thinking, now, how do we make sense of it?
It really starts in 2007, and I've tried to make it finish in 2017. Basically, is what we're talking about, is really a 10-year period. And that 10-year period is not finished now, so I'm not saying how it's going to finish. But it's something that somebody in future years will go, this is really, really interesting. Thank you.